Darren from Protopilot here. This week we're going to be exploring Figma's prototyping capabilities by building a basic app login. We'll then compare Figma's prototyping process to Protopie's to see how the two tools differ in both their approach and features. Prototyping has never had such a high profile, with a whole host of tools now giving you the varying ability to realise your designs beyond their static UI. It's fair to say that prototyping within tools has been a bit of a battlefield, with some tools offering basic prototyping on top of their established drawing features, and others offering a more advanced but specialised set of prototyping features to enable designers to build more realistic experiences. So today I want to look at Figma and Protopie, who offer on the surface an overlap of features, but with differences in their capabilities and approach to prototyping. So Figma, if you don't know, is a fully fledged UI creation tool that has some prototyping capabilities. Its prototyping features allow you to do basic click-throughs, and it has some nice simple motion design capabilities as well. Protopie, on the other hand, is not a UI creation tool per se. Its focus is on interaction design and prototyping, relying on tools such as Figma for UI creation. With Protopie, you can build everything from basic click-throughs all the way up to high fidelity prototypes, to a point where you'd be hard pushed to differentiate them from real apps. So this tutorial will hopefully give you a good overview of what each tool is capable of doing, how they work individually, but also how they can work together to complete your prototyping arsenal. So in this tutorial, we're going to be building a basic app login. So let's just kind of have a quick talk through this. So I've got a start screen. So this is going to be my app start, which is going to animate into this login screen. When the login screen animates in, it's going to give focus to the username input field. So the keyboard's going to come up. We're then going to look at how we might prototype a failure scenario. So if the login credentials aren't correct. And then finally, we're going to prototype a success scenario and allow the user to log in to the home screen of the app. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at doing that in Figma first, and then I'm going to do it in Protopie, and then this will give us the ability to compare the features and the approaches that we'll take within both tools. So without further ado, let's get cracking. So Figma works by linking screens together. You define a start and end state, and then an animation type to define what happens in between. So our start state is this start screen, and in Figma speak, these screens are called frames. So we've got a start frame, and then our login frame is the end of our first transition. And there's a couple of things we need to look at first. So make sure you're on the prototyping tab. So by default, you would be on design tab when you're drawing your UI. So make sure you switch over to the prototyping tab. And before we get into linking anything together, we just have a quick look at what options we've got here. So when you go into prototyping presentation mode, you can make your prototype look like it's on a particular device. So we've got an iPhone 11 Pro here. So I'm going to choose the frame for an iPhone 11 Pro. And I'm going to make it silver. Background of a presentation, absolutely fine. We can leave that black, and you can also define the starting frame here, which is correct. We are using start as our starting frame, so that's all good. Okay, so if I select this first frame, you'll see there's this little node kind of halfway down on the right hand side. So this is one way we can use to connect our artboards together. Another way is to do it manually. So again, with our artboard selected, you can see we've got this interaction section available where we can effectively build our transition by filling in the different boxes. I'm going to use this way where you can drag out this pick whip and point it to the screen you want to transition to. So in this case, I want to transition to the login screen. And that does a whole bunch of work for me. all I need to do is make a few changes. So for our prototype, we effectively want to animate this logo from this big logo in the center of application load and animate it into this position on login. And you can see as I highlight over this logo, you can see it's picked up what it thinks is the same object on other frames. And this is part of a particular type of animation that Figma uses called Smart Animate. And Smart Animate works by identifying objects on different frames which it thinks it's the same, and then when you choose Smart Animate, it will animate the differences in between, which is exactly what we want to use for the first transition. So that's good. Going back to our prototyping contextual panel, we actually want to start our animation using the after delay interaction. So after delay is essentially an automatic transition, an automatic interaction that will start the animation for us. We've got the ability to set the duration of how long the transition is going to run for. So we're going to leave it at 800 milliseconds. And we're going to, so this is the delay effectively, how long it's going to delay for. So the app's going to load, it's going to wait just under a second, and then it's going to start its animation. Because we use the pick whip, we've already told Figma that we want to navigate from one frame to another. So we've got the option navigate to which has been selected. There are some other options for doing other things which are kind of beyond the scope of this particular tutorial, but something we can look into, or you can look into another time. And then we've got the frame we want to navigate to, which is login. So we did all of that work just by using the pick whip, which is cool. The second thing we want to look at is the animation. So this is how we control the animation type. So by default, because we use the pick whip, and because Figma has sensed that we've got these duplicate objects, it's chosen Smart Animate by default, which is handy. That's what we want. Underneath Smart Animate, we've got some easing curves, or also known as interpolators. So the way the animation is going to move based on is going to be controlled to an extent by the easing curve. So we're just going to stick to a basic ease out. And then we've got a timer here which gives us the ability to control how long that animation is going to take. So Figma by default gives us 300 milliseconds. And I think for this particular stage, we're just going to leave it at 300 milliseconds to see how it looks. Okay, so effectively we've set up our first transition from the start screen to the login screen. We want to run that and see what that looks like. So to run a prototype, you just go over to the top right hand corner and you hit this play button. That's going to create a new tab. It's going to load our prototype and it's going to run our animation. Okay, so let's just, if we hover down here, there's a little restart button, or you can just press R on the keyboard to run it again. So holds for 800 milliseconds, and then it does the Smart Animate to animate into place, and that's our first transition. But you'll notice that the login panel kind of comes in a little bit too quickly, kind of before the logo is animated into place. So I want to fix that. I want to make sure that the logo gets to where it's going before this form loads in. So we can just go back to our authoring mode, which is this tab here. And to do this, I'm going to create another frame in between these two frames. So if I just move these three screens along, because we're not going to be dealing with them in this particular tutorial. Let's move them way off screen. Okay, so we're going to duplicate the login frame. And we're going to, what we basically want to do, we want to delay when the input fields come in. So we're going to set these two input fields go back into design mode. We're going to set the layer opacity to 0. And we're going to go back into prototyping mode so we can get to our nodes. So we now need to set up a transition between this second. Actually, let's just rename this login start. We'll rename this login complete. Okay, so we want to connect these two frames together. So again, I'm going to get my pick whip and I'm going to connect it to the new screen. And if I select that, I can get access to all of the animation interaction properties. So again, I'm going to use after delay. And I'm going to, let's leave it at 1 millisecond. So effectively 1 millisecond is the smallest amount of time. So that's effectively instant, so no delay. And we've already used the pick whip to tell us where it's going to, and we're going to keep it as smart animate. We're going to keep everything else the same. And let's see what that looks like. So we're just going to restart our prototype. Okay, so it animates into position, and then the form comes in. Okay, that's good. One thing I just noticed is that we'd neglected, or I'd neglected, not you, nothing to do with you. I neglected to also change the opacity of the title. So let's just do that as well. Again, we want to change the layer opacity to 0. And if we run that, hit R, that's better. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, so that's our first transition done. The second thing we want to do is when we get to this screen, we want to make the username field have focus. So because it's a login and because we know that we want the user to type in the username first, it's a nice, helpful, smart default from a UX perspective to bring up that keyboard. So the keyboard's actually here off screen. So you can't see it because Figma essentially clips anything that's outside of the frame, but you can see in the layers panel that it's here. And that's fine. We want it to be off screen for this particular state. We also now want to duplicate the frame again. And we'll call this login keyboard up. And we need to find the keyboard in this frame, which is here. And we're just going to move it into position. There you go. Go back to prototyping mode. And again, we'll get our pick whip and we'll point it at the next screen. Change the interaction to after delay. Leave the delay again at 1 millisecond, and we're going to leave everything else at its defaults. So now what should happen is the logo will animate into position, then the login form will appear, and then the keyboard will appear. So let's run that and see what that looks like. Okay. Looking good. But there's kind of a problem here, just from obviously we're mimicking a real app with some fake components, and there's no real indication that this username field is selected. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, again, go back into design mode. Just make this a little bit bigger. I'm just going to add a cursor using the pipe symbol on the keyboard. So I'm just going to mimic a flashing cursor. Obviously we can't make it flash in Figma because it doesn't have that capability. I'm just going to make the color black to make it a bit more noticeable. And if I go back to the prototype now, hit R to run it again. So it animates in, and then it shows the cursor. So this completes kind of the first section of the prototype we're going to build in Figma. What we're going to do now is we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it inside of ProtoPie. So you can see the differences in how you would build this kind of thing to give you a comparison on the two tools and how they work. Okay, so let's now look at see how we can achieve the same thing in ProtoPie. To prototype my login in ProtoPie, I need to import assets from Figma. The first thing I need to do before I import anything is just to make sure my assets are optimized. And then because I'm doing all of the interaction inside of ProtoPie, all I need from Figma are these assets here that I've got on screen. So let me just kind of run you through some considerations. So when you bring graphics into ProtoPie from Figma, there's a few things that you need to know. So for my logo, I want that to be a single asset. So just make sure it's a flattened vector. Otherwise, if it's all different paths and it's a group of paths, it's going to bring it in as a whole group and it's going to make it more difficult to use. I'm going to keep, just for reference, going to have all these items for my login screen. This second logo is just a reference. We'll see what I mean by that when we get into ProtoPie. And I've got my two text fields here. Just make sure that just to let you know that if you create components in Figma and you bring them into ProtoPie, then it's going to flatten them. So ProtoPie can't understand components, Figma components, and it won't bring them in as separate items. So if you need access to those separate items, so for example, if I needed access to this text field individually, as well as the kind of frame of the input field, then I need to bring them in as just like a standard group and not a component. But these are pretty much all ready to go. On the home screen, this is obviously a bit further along the line, but when we come to that, you'll see that I've got a group here of my cards and groups mapped to groups in ProtoPie. Also text objects also match to text objects in ProtoPie. So basically, just be aware that components will flatten your graphics. Sometimes you want to do that. Sometimes it's good to just flatten your graphical furniture to make it simpler because you don't need access to, and components is a good way of doing that. It still gives you access to all the individual items inside of Figma, but flattens it for ProtoPie. So that might be something you want to use to your advantage. So I'm going to switch over to ProtoPie. So I've already got a standard Pi set up. So this is like default settings. So I am using the iPhone 11 Pro as my target device. So that's what I get by default, which is good. I also get this scene one by default. So we're going to be creating our initial animation in this first scene. And I'm going to go to the import button here in the top left-hand corner, and I'm going to choose Figma. Now you can see here that ProtoPie and Figma were talking to each other. If you've not done this before, you're going to need to use your Figma login to connect ProtoPie and Figma together. Once you've done this, you don't really need to do it again. It will just kind of remember that for any kind of future imports. You can see that Figma import is still in beta. Don't worry too much about that. It's working perfectly fine. I think it's going to come out of beta soon. But yeah, there's nothing to worry about. It's I haven't run into any issues when using this importer. So just a little bit about the import box. So you can see here we've got our frames. So ProtoPie can essentially see our Figma frames, and it can see that because that's the active Figma file that I've got in the background. So you just need to make sure that you've got the file you want to import, you've got that in the background, and you can see my frames here. You can see there's an import size here, so this might be familiar to you if you work in app development. So this is the pixel density. because Protopie brings in its assets as bitmaps, essentially as images, as pixel-based images, this allows you to bring it in at the correct size. The import size that you should use should map to the input, the pixel density that you should use needs to map to the device pixel density you're using. So iPhone 11 Pro is also 3x. So as long as those two match, you're good to go. I would just then leave all of these other options as defaults. I might go into a later video, but you can have a read through these. They're pretty self-explanatory. I don't really ever touch the import settings. I just leave them as defaults, and that's going to work for me. So that's what I'm going to do here. And we're just going to bring in the start screen. So let's hit import. Okay, so I've brought in my first screen. So remember, the start screen has just got the logo, and you can see here that it's come in as a single image. So that's good. I also need, so as we saw in Figma, the transitions happens between two screens. So I also need the second screen. So I need to go back to the import, back to Figma. And I'm going to choose the login frame. And I'm going to import this in as well. It's up to you how you do this. As far as how you import objects, I've kind of got to a stage now where I just mainly use tools as an asset manager. So I might have just a whole artboard full of objects that I want to import, and I import them all in the same import. But entirely up to you how you want to do this. For us, we're not going to use this item yet, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And we've got now all of our assets on this single scene. So just a word about scenes in Protopie. So scenes are the same as frames in Figma. So you can have multiple scenes within your prototype. You don't need to use scenes to build prototypes in Protopie. It really depends on how much you want to put into a single scene. It really depends on how much complexity you've got there. The more you put in, the more complex a single scene can become. So scenes, you can think of scenes in Protopie as a way of compartmentalizing the interaction design that you're doing. There is some pros and cons to using scenes or not using scenes, depending on what you're doing. For us, we're going to be using scenes for the entirety of this video series, but we're going to use a single scene for this first section. Okay, so I've got my two logos. I've got logo and logo 2. So we're just going to do a bit of organization. So as we saw in the Figma section, I want to initially animate my logo in. So I'm just going to take these two text field graphics, and I'm going to turn the opacity down. So with them selected, I'm just going to pull the opacity down to 0, get them out of the way, and I'm going to do that for my title as well. Okay, so that leaves me with these two logos. Now in Protopie, I don't transition between two states. So Protopie doesn't have a smart animate feature. It doesn't work the same way as Figma does. Protopie is probably a little bit more of a conventional animation tool. It's the model that it uses is a bit more conventional. It's more similar to tools such as After Effects. So it animates properties over time. That's how it works. So I'm still going to use this logo too. I'm going to use it as a reference for the values that I need, but I'm not going to be needing it after that. So the first thing I'm going to be working with is this logo. This is main logo. And as we saw in Figma, we were using this interaction, which was called delay, start delay. So we're going to find a similar capability within Protopie. So the first thing I need to do, and this is the way you start all of your Protopie documents, is you add a trigger. Protopie's got many more triggers than Figma has. Like I said in the introduction, it's a much more advanced capability interaction design tool. That's kind of its specialization. So for a comparative trigger to Figma's start delay, we're going to use, if I can find it, start. So kind of similar naming. So this does exactly the same thing. It's going to automatically, when my scene loads, it's going to automatically do the stuff that I put within it. Okay, so on start, and this is just going to start immediately, I'm going to want to do two things. So this is where it gets a little bit more involved. So whereas in Figma we had our big logo and our small logo, and we were animating two properties, the scale of the logo and also the position of the logo. We're going to have to add those two separately in Protopie. So with this selected, I'm going to go into my start trigger. I'm going to add what's called responses. So in Protopie, you first add a trigger, and then once you've got a trigger, you can then add responses to that trigger. So you can think of responses as just actions, things that you want to do. So we want to move the logo, and we also want to scale the logo. Okay, so you can see these are orange. So this means that I've got some incomplete values here. I haven't really filled this out yet. So you can see for the move one, it's chosen the right layer, which is my logo layer. Here, it hasn't picked it up, so I'm just going to choose that there. So I'm going to move and scale my logo. Now I'm going to go back to this reference object because I want to know the size of it and also the position. So if we do the position first, since we've got move kind of lined up first. So this smaller logo size is 96 square. So that's its scale. So if we come over to our scale response, and we're going to scale by size, and we're going to scale to a specific size, and we're going to scale to that 96 by 96. Okay, so you can now see that the scale response has gone white. That means that Protopie has got everything it needs for this particular response. And we can, if we just hide this for a second, so we can just hit the eye and turn this off because we don't really need to see it. It's also something you have to do in Protopie. It will show everything that you see in your 3D environment. You'll see it in your prototype. So we're gonna go over to preview here. So this is like the inbuilt preview window, and where you can preview your animations. If we hit preview, okay, that happened incredibly fast. Let's just replay that. So you've got this little replay icon in the bottom left hand corner. Okay, so that's going incredibly fast, and you can see it's kind of off center, and it's not in the right position. Okay, so let's just go back to that. That's because we obviously haven't set the position yet. We've only set the scale. Okay, but it's still a little bit too fast. So if we come down into the context panel for scale, you can see down the bottom here, we've got a duration. Now, if you remember, we actually delayed our animation by 800 milliseconds. And then we use a duration of 300 milliseconds. So if we do the same thing here, now in Protopie, it doesn't use milliseconds, it uses seconds. So there's a decimal point involved. So you can see here, by default, it gives me a duration of 0.2, which is effectively 200 milliseconds. I'm going to change that to 0.3 to match the 300 milliseconds. And I'm going to set a delay to 0.8 to match our 800 milliseconds. Okay, so we preview that. Okay, so that's a little bit slower, and that's kind of a little bit more on form. Okay, the second thing we want to do is we want to move it into the correct position. So if we go back to our logo reference object, just turn off the eye to show that, we now need its position. So its position is 140 pixels by 55 pixels. So let's pump those, so 140 by 55. So we're going to take our logo and we're going to move it to the same position, 140 by 55. Okay. Turn our reference off. Go back to, before we do that, let's just make sure we've got the same duration. So we want 0.3, and we're also going to delay it by 0.8. Okay, so let's run that. Okay. So we've got our animation kind of animating into position, and you may not be able to see it, but it's kind of coming from the left to the right, even though it's in the central position. This is because in Protopie you have control over the registration point, so the point at which your animations or the transformations happen. So if we go back to our logo here, you can see we've got an origin of the top left hand corner. So we want to set that. We're actually going to set it to, let's set it to the center. Okay, so now we've set it to the center, we've already added our values. Those values are now going to change because Protopie is going to measure the origin points from the center. So you can see now my positions and my sizes have all changed. So we're going to need to go back to our reference object, and we're going to have to also set that to the center. And now we've got a new set of values. So we need to go back and actually update these responses to reflect these values. Otherwise, it's not going to animate into the correct position. So size is fine. Size is exactly the same. So all we need to deal with is the position values, the X and Y values. So we've got 188 and 103. So we just need to change that to 188 and 103. Okay, so if we now turn off our reference object, go back to preview, and it animates into position. Okay, so that's the first part of our initial app load completed in Protopie. The second thing we want to do is we want to, once the logo is animated into position, we want to show the text fields and the title. Before we do that, we need to do some work on the text fields. And this is going to be for the next section where we actually interact with them. So what we're going to do here is actually we can completely delete our reference logo too, because we don't need that anymore. We've done that animation. We're going to select these two text fields. We're going to bring the opacity back up, and we're actually just going to turn off our logo for a second so we can see these text fields. So you can see at the moment they're in a group, and they've got a username text object, remembering that Figma text comes over as text for Protopie. You'll see at the moment, even though it's a text object, it's not editable. So this preserves the typeface and the type styling. There's some things you can do around that to make sure you keep your type styling, but it really depends on if you want control over the text or not within your prototype. So we can leave that as is for now. If you do want to work with text in Protopie, then with your text field selected, you can just hit this convert to text button. It'll convert it to real text. But we can see here we've got this kind of fake username. We've got this background, and it's not a real input field. Now in Protopie, we've got real input fields. We've got real keyboards, and we've got the ability to input real text. So what we want to do is we want to actually replace these two groups with real text fields. So we're going to use them as a kind of like a template, and again as a reference object. So we're going to come over to our text menu item here, and we're going to choose input. And we're going to choose import. It brings in kind of a very ugly standard looking input field, but don't worry, we can customize this to our heart's content, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to effectively make this look exactly the same as our input field here. So looking at the styling of our input field, we can see it's got a width of 308. So let's get the styling correct first, get the size correct, and it's also got a height of 48. So we're going to make this 48. So I know the background color's white. So if we scroll down here, we come to our background styling. We can see here, we can change this to white. That's good. And we don't need a border, so we're going to turn the border off. Okay, that's good. So we've got some radius corners on here, which let me just double check what they are. In Figma, I believe they're 8. Yeah, so we've got a radius of 8. So let's find our radius. So background style radius here. So we're going to type in 8 here. Okay, starting to look pretty similar. That's pretty good. The final thing we want to do is we want to style the placeholder text. So within Protopie input fields, we've got real placeholder text. So we need to find the placeholder text option. And you can see at the moment it just says input, so we want that to be username. And I just need to grab the color of the text, which is 89, 89, 89. That's easy to remember, even for someone of my age. So let's find the text styling. So 89, 89, 89. So the final thing we need to do, we need to change the typeface. So I'm using Museo Sans. I think I'm using 300. Nope, it's probably more like 500. That's good. Okay, so you can see now we've got this input. Let's just rename this input username. And we just need to put it into position. Okay. And we've now effectively created our username text field, so we can remove our graphical one. And actually, we can duplicate this username text field. Just Command D, Control D on Windows, and we're going to rename this password. And we're just going to put this into position and remove our graphic password. Okay, that's cool. Just for a little bit of tidying, so, well, not just tidying, but also control. So let's just bring our title back up. Now, we've got these three objects, and we actually want them to animate in exactly the same way. We want to apply an opacity to them all uniformly. So we could do it individually, but that's going to mean adding more things to our prototype. So what we can do is we can group them all together. So that's just Command G, and we can call this form. And what we can do now is we can now control the opacity of the group, and all of its nested items will inherit any attributes that we change. So let's go to opacity. We're going to turn that down. Okay. So our form's kind of ready to go. We can bring our logo back up. And what we want to do is we want to, after the logo's animated in, we want to fade in our form. So if we go back and look at the duration, the animation values, and in fact there's a timeline in Protopie. If I can just adjust things a little bit here. It's a very basic timeline. So you can see my move and my scale is happening here. So this shows you the starting point and the duration, so the delay and the duration. So I'm going to select my form group, and I'm going to want to change the opacity. So we've set it at 0 opacity. I'm now going to want to bring it up to 100% opacity. So I'm going to choose the opacity response, and I'm going to change the opacity to 100. And I can actually just move this over, and I can actually kind of say, well, I want this animation to kind of like happen first. So let's do it like that. And maybe I can either drag this in and out, and you can see that's affecting the value down here. So it's quite handy when you're choreographing animation like this, and you can just kind of see you can get it in the right position. You can see it kind of snaps to the end state there. I'm going to change the duration to, let's go 0.3 as well. Okay, so unfortunately you can't scrub this timeline. It's just a visual representation, and also gives you those abilities to change it. But effectively, I should have everything in place. So the animation is going to run, basically the logo movement is going to run, and then the input fields and the form is going to come in. So let's run that and see what that looks like. Cool. So that looks good. That looks pretty similar to what we created in Figma. So the final thing we need to do is we want to give focus to the first input field. So we want to bring a keyword up. So like I said, in ProtoPie we have a real keyboard, so we don't have to worry about bringing in fake keyboards and fake keyboard graphics. We can just effectively do that for real. So we're going to use the username input field. So we're going to select that. And we're going to add another response, which is called focus. So we've got a couple of options here. You can either use you can focus in, or you can focus out of an object. So we want to use focus in, and we also need to delay that. So I want that to match the point at when my form comes in. So we don't want it to focus before the form is shown. So we know we've got a start delay of 1.1 here and a duration of 0.3. So it's going to take 1.4 seconds to arrive. So if we set that to 1.4. Okay, so let's run that. And up comes our keyboard. And you can see in ProtoPie we've got a real cursor because it's a real input field. And one of the things to bear in mind with the preview window in ProtoPie is that in the preview window, this keyboard is a fake keyboard. It's not a real keyboard, so you can't tap on it. You can see it just goes away when I tap on it. If you downloaded this prototype onto your phone using the free ProtoPie player, then you would be able to use your phone's keyboard, your native keyboard. When you're previewing, when you're working in the authoring environment, you actually need to use the keyboard that's connected to your computer. So your computer keyboard is the real keyboard, and that's what you can use to type in. So I can type my name in here, and you can see that's working for real. Okay, so this is the first section of our basic login form, how you would build it in ProtoPie. So hopefully you can see how the two tools kind of compare to each other. So just to go over, we've got frames which kind of match to scenes. We've got two different animation models. So we've got Figma using this smart animate and these transitions between the start end state, whereas ProtoPie uses this trigger response, giving you the ability to affect specific properties. But on top of what Figma gives you, ProtoPie gives you some more advanced functionality with the ability that we've seen so far, which is to show a real keyboard and use real input fields, whereas that's something we had to fake on the Figma side of things. So this completes the first section, part 1. Please join me in part 2, where we'll be completing the other half of our basic login form, and we'll be doing the same thing again. We'll be going first in Figma and building the first, how we would complete that kind of journey in Figma, and then we'll switch over to ProtoPie and look at how we might do it there. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.